Okay, we're going to get started. Just another logistical issue for those who have great questions but are not so Twitter friendly. What we've done is we've brought up some mics here on either side. We're still going to have limited time for questions. Obviously, we want to take as many as we can. We want to make sure that those who do not have Twitter accounts have the opportunity to ask questions as well. So as the panel comes and once we get to the Q&A portions, just feel free, of course, you can continue to tweet if you have a question, but also if you don't have a Twitter account, you can just come to the mic up front. This is one of those times again where I'll just take a little bit of privilege here to make sure we thank some of our political leadership that's here. Is Morris Kent here? Morris Kent represents George Baradas' office. Thank you so much for being here. They've been incredibly supportive. Jasmine Barnaby, are you still here? Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Jasmine from Katie Edwards' office. State Representative Katie Edwards. Terry Coriata, are you still here? I think she is still here. She might just be out for lunch. She is with Representative Raymichael Vasalinda, and I think she's really important, and I'll talk to her more about this, but she actually sits on the Florida Stand Against Human Trafficking Legislative Working Group. Florida does have its own group, and the legislators have pulled together, again, a bipartisan effort to address this issue, and she's been instrumental in that work. Jeremy Shear with Sobel's office, I think he left, but Senator Sobel has been fantastic for us for quite some time. And Elaine Wiggers from House Representative Dave Kerner's office. Elaine, you here? No? Okay. Well, and Judge Stacey Ross, are you back yet? Okay, I'm going to make sure that we raise this again. And for those who need Wi-Fi access, and you're a guest, you're not a Broward College student or employee, what you'll do is go to username, type Bailey, and then your password is Bailey, and you should be in. So if you need to respond to any emails while you sit here, we want to make sure you have the opportunity to do that. Yes. For Wi-Fi access, your username is Bailey, like Bailey Concert Hall, B-A-I-L-E-Y. Yes, and your password is the same, B-A-I-L-E-Y. Under guest, right? Okay. We are now going to move on to the portion regarding the science of abolition. And you've heard him speak earlier today. Now you're going to hear really how the work gets done. I'm going to welcome to the stage, or to the podium, Executive Director of Free the Slaves, Maurice Middleburg. Actually, let's cue the video, and then Maurice will begin thereafter.
It's fascinating to think that slavery has been abolished so many years ago and it still exists. Unfortunately, some authorities do not even want to think that slavery exists.
Slavery, this is a very old word around the world. The phenomenon of slavery exists.
Is a violation of human rights. When a person is in slavery, they cannot move from one place to another. They are not paid. And they want to come out of that slavery. However, they cannot find the wage.
Slavery is affecting our nation, but unfortunately, it is not realized by the governments now.
Child servitude is an important issue in what we call the cradle of West Africa.
Slavery, a traditional type of slavery which is now abolished by the law. However, at the same time there are modern day slavery as well. For children, they are working in the stone quarries and carpet factories. Many girls, young girls and women, they are forced to be trafficked in the sex trade.
hundreds of people who are working. When you see them, you cannot know what's in their hearts. So when you speak to them, then you see people who have so many problems. You are going to discover that they have debts. Some of them have submitted sexual act before they get jobs, and so many other human violations.
For adults, they may have taken some amount of money from people they call sponsors. But in return, they are expected to work for these masters or sponsors as long as they are able to repay the debt. But there is a scheme in place where you can never really repay these debts, because the more you work, the more they continue to add you money, so you are permanently trapped in that kind of situation.
In some minds, you can see children, you can see women, you can see men, you can see young men, and all ages are really involved working in very hard conditions.
In fishing communities, often you will see children who are engaged in fishing by themselves, unaccompanied, working from dusk to dawn to catch fish that they don't even serve them on their meal. When you see children fishing on the lake, at first sight you question yourself, it is really happening? It's just at the backyard of the community. Do people see this? Are these children safe?
There are two words to explain what's happening: separation and exploitation. The kid is separated from his family and he is exploited by another one for housework. Sometimes you can see with the clothes and you can see injury in the skins. That kind of stuff you look for the mistreatment and compare with another kids.
Originally, I trained as a professional teacher, so during teaching, I came face to face with most of these issues and how a lot of children are not able to attend school simply because the parents cannot take care of them. After a year or two, the children stop coming to school. You ask around, and they've gone down south to work.
In most cases, parents compare the situation. They have to see hope in the community before deciding to retrieve their kids.
We have them to get organized and to realize by themselves what is slavery and how to fight against it.
We involve the communities themselves to find out a solution, and they have to carry out activities themselves to come out of this.
Wherever we have approached, after a few years we see that the area has been completely slavery-free.
We live with hope we can change the situation in Haiti.
My hope and dream for the future is to see a Ghana without slavery, without child labor, where every child can have access to education, healthcare, shelter, clothing, and also to see families that are capable and able to take care of their children.
I can dream of South Asia without slavery, almost like a diamond, which will shine in the whole planet, which will bring peace and prosperity around the globe.
It's okay, you can applaud. Good afternoon. The folks you just saw on the screen there were all staff Free the Slaves, and it's an enormous source of pride of the work that they do. Now, we had a terrific opening, a great panel this morning to talk about slavery in Florida. But what I want to ask you to do is to now look beyond Florida, indeed beyond the borders of the United States, for a global perspective on slavery. Now, I'm deliberately using the term slavery rather than trafficking. Slavery consists of duping and coercing people, then holding them by violence, manipulation, and threat to perform labor or sexual services that are dangerous and degrading, with without compensation, and without the freedom to leave that work, all for the profit of others. Now, we support an ashram in India that is a shelter for girls who have been trafficked into the sex trade. During my last visit there, I saw a little girl who could not have been more than 8 years old. So let's call this evil by its proper name, which is slavery. Now, why as Americans should we be concerned about slavery outside our doors? Well, you heard part of the answer to that this morning. The vast majority of slaves live outside the United States. Persons enter slavery abroad and then are trafficked into the United States, including here in South Florida. Slavery taints the goods we purchase and the companies in which we invest. Slavery undermines the rule of law, induces corruption, and perpetuates poverty in countries that matter to us. Slavery is a highly lucrative source of income for organized crime. The persistence of slavery on a global scale is an insidious influence on our lives as Americans. But much more than naked self-interest, our experience is that Americans are repulsed by slavery and want our country to show leadership on an issue that has so affected our own history. In the fight against slavery, we can draw lessons from the history of abolitionism and other social movements. The eradication of modern slavery will depend on the joining of science, art, and politics. We will need our hearts and our brains, and we will need to act in concert. We're going to need powerful political coalitions in the most affected countries that help bring about the central government action. There has been some progress in this area, I'm happy to report, as the bipartisan support for action exemplified by the speakers you saw both in person and via video today. We applaud the leaders of both parties for the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection and Recovery Act. Slavery, which was not long ago not the case, slavery is now illegal everywhere. International conventions forbid slavery in all its form. Nonetheless, in some countries the underlying laws are quite weak. Criminal penalties are often minimal. There are other aspects that put people at risk, particularly with regard to gender. In Nepal, women need the permission of their fathers or husbands to secure basic citizenship rights. Business supply chains are often far from transparent, leaving them open to abuse. Enforcement of existing laws is often weak. For that reason, we at Free the Slaves work with advocacy coalitions to secure better laws and more vigorous law enforcement. Art gives voice to the powerless and the marginalized. Rhetoric, poetry, and imagery by on behalf of those who have experienced slavery are powerful tools for mobilizing support for the anti-slavery movement. In recent years, there's been a cascade of dramatic books and films and photographs that have buoyed the abolitionist movement. In fact, a new documentary called Stand With Me is going to be released this weekend and will be shown in 30 cities over the next 2 months. But politics and art must be supported by evidence as to what actually works in preventing and ending slavery. The political momentum behind abolitionism will accelerate as we gather proof that policies and programs are effective. The art of abolitionism will move from pain to hope when we know we can bring about change. So today I want to focus our attention on uncovering what works in combating slavery. The great challenge to the modern abolition movement is distilling an effective, evidence-based strategy for eradicating slavery. In short, we need a science of abolition. Careful reasoning and data must guide public policy and programs. We must know the size of the slavery problem, who is affected, why it happens, and which interventions make a difference. Now, what I want to do is share with you our thinking at Free the Slaves about what a science of abolitionism might actually look like. In brief, we believe that slavery is driven by 5 specific weaknesses in poor and marginalized communities. Ending slavery will come from developing assets in at-risk communities that offset those specific vulnerabilities. Now let me begin by drawing a portrait of modern slavery. How many people are affected, where they are, what slavery looks like, and why slavery happens. The 2012 report of the International Labor Organization puts the global number of slaves at 21 million. However, the ILO does not include in its estimates certain types of slavery, notably forced marriage. A more recent publication, the Global Slavery Index, which uses a more expansive definition of slavery, puts the number at 30 million worldwide. What is clearly the case is that tens of millions of people are in a state of slavery. And slavery exists in every country, including those in the Western Hemisphere. Now, in the next panel, you're going to hear from speakers from Brazil and Haiti. But the region with the most slaves is Asia, especially South Asia, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa, with concentrations in Central and Western Africa. Together, Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa make up more than 3/4 of all the slaves in the world. In the vast majority of cases, slaves are living in their home countries and often near the communities in which they were born. According to the ILO, over half of all slaves are women and girls, and about 1/4 of slaves are children. 2/3 of slaves are in forced labor in the private sector. Now, this is typically labor-intensive work that is frequently dangerous, such as agriculture, mining, fishing, construction, textiles, garments, and restaurants. Conversely to the overall portrait of slavery, in the private sector, more than half of the slaves are men. Sexual slavery accounts for about 1/5 of all slaves, and there's another smaller group of what might be termed political slaves. And these are people who are put into prison through an abuse of the judicial system and then put to work in factories or other economic sectors for the profit of the state or agents of the state, and or cases of coercion by armed factions like child soldiers. Now, what does slavery actually look like? In India, slavery is often in the form of debt bondage. Marginalized people borrow money from loan sharks who demand free labor to repay debt. But this is like peonage in the Old South here in the United States. The debt never actually gets paid off, and the debtor ends up in perpetual slavery. We know of cases of slavery that started with a loan of as little as $18. Worse yet, the family inherits the debt, and the debt is passed on to children, so you then get intergenerational slavery. In Nepal, young women in rural areas are lured to the city with a promise of a job in a restaurant or a bar, but of course, it turns out to be a brothel. In Ghana, the families of boys from poor villages are told that their sons will have jobs on fishing boats, where they become slaves. In Brazil, men are promised jobs in the forest and the lumber industry, but once they get there, they are, in fact, slave labor camps, where they spend their days working as slaves in the lumber industry and making charcoal. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, armed factions in the eastern part of the country force girls into so-called marriages and boys into working in the mines. In Haiti, rural families that lack the resources to care for their children entrust their daughters to families in the cities. These children then become domestic servants. The promise of schooling and a better life never materializes for these girls. In all of these cases, the work is brutal, violence and the threat of violence are commonplace, and sexual abuse is frequent. Now, why does slavery persist? How can it be? It is 2014. How can it be that this ancient curse is still upon us? In a word, the root cause of slavery is vulnerability. While no group or class is immune, slavery overwhelmingly consists of people who are poor, desperate, uneducated, marginalized, and unprotected. But I want to be clear here. Poverty alone does not cause slavery. We don't have to wait for the end of poverty to eradicate slavery. On the contrary, slavery is most common among identifiable groups of poor people burdened by very specific forms of vulnerability that can be addressed. In many cases, people do not know their basic rights. They themselves accept the condition of forced labor and exploitation. The example of debt bondage in India is a case in point. People who have that kind of debt actually accept the notion that the moneylender has the right to hold them as servants forever until the debt is repaid. They don't know that the moneylender is committing a crime. The schemes and promises of traffickers sound attractive and plausible. If you're extremely poor, the promise of a job is highly alluring. So people who have only bad choices put themselves in the hands of traffickers. Poor communities often lack effective local organizations or functioning governments that can serve as protectors against those who perpetrate enslavement. In places like Haiti, there is a long history of deliberately atomizing communities and preventing the emergence of effective organizations that might become a political threat. Disorganized communities are especially vulnerable to becoming enslaved. Where basic social and economic services are absent or weak, this leads to exploitation by those who fill the void. People turn to loan sharks in the absence of a legitimate source of credit. Children who are not in school are especially vulnerable to being trafficked. A health crisis in a family can drive people into debt and therefore into slavery. Poor and marginalized communities are also the ones least likely to be protected by the law. Inadequate financing of police and the judiciary constrains law enforcement. The number of successful prosecutions for slavery is a tiny fraction of the number of crimes committed. Restitution to victims is very rare. There are few, if any, penalties for businesses that tolerate slavery in their supply chains. In such circumstances, there is a huge incentive for slavery since the profits are high and the costs and risks are low. Tragically, it is the survivors of slavery, we heard a case in point this morning on the panel, the survivors of slavery are especially vulnerable. They are usually traumatized as a result of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. They may have developed a real or perceived dependence on their slaveholders. They're often impoverished and may need to acquire marketable skills. They're frequently stigmatized by their own families and communities, and this is especially true for women and girls who have been the victims of sexual slavery. So they're at very high risk of becoming re-enslaved. So let me recap as to why slavery happens. It exists everywhere. The majority are in South Asia and West and Central Africa. 2/3 are in the private sector, largely in specific known industries. Another fifth consists of sexual slavery. It's overwhelmingly found in certain clearly identifiable groups and communities. Specific factors lead to slavery. In most places, slavery is not actually hard to find if you choose to look for it and you know how. So here, my friends, is the beginning of a science of abolition. We know where slavery occurs. We know who is principally affected. We have learned from experience why and how slavery takes place. It follows that slavery can be prevented and undermined by reversing the underlying vulnerabilities. Now, this line of reasoning has led Free the Slaves to develop a model for preventing and eradicating slavery that derives from our experience and the available evidence. Our abolition model focuses on 5 actions aimed at overcoming the vulnerabilities that lead to slavery. These are rights and risks education, community mobilization, increasing access to services, increasing the risks and costs of perpetrating slavery, and support to slavery survivors. If slaveholders prey on the uneducated, then the solution is rights and risks education. Our programs support rights and risks education for about 15,000 people in a typical year. Our approach is to use research to draw out the stories of slavery and abuse from the target communities, and then build a curriculum that is based on those stories. In Ghana and Haiti, for example, we work with local partners to develop a curriculum and an illustrated booklet that focuses on child slavery and exploitation. Trained facilitators lead village-based learning groups through discussions of child rights and protection. Now, this approach is proving to be very effective in mobilizing parents against child slavery. During a recent visit to Southeast Haiti, I met with one of the learning groups, and I was really struck with one of the men in the learning group said, "We were in obscurity, now we are in the light. No one will ever take our children again." In the next panel, you're going to hear from my friend and one of our partners, Gerda Constant, from the Fondation Ni la Vie, Light Foundation. You'll learn more about this program. Now, the education of individuals has to be accompanied by collective action. Now, our partners and we encourage the creation of village and neighborhood committees that mobilize action against slavery. Our program supports 650 to 700 such committees every year. And they are sometimes called community vigilance committees or community protection committees or child protection committees. But they basically serve as educators and watchdogs and advocates that provide information to their neighbors, look out for traffickers, follow up on suspected cases of enslavement, and advocate for better services and police protection. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, our partners have helped miners and mining communities in eastern Congo become organized so they can protect themselves from the threat of slavery and exploitation. We work with local partners to help communities access legitimate sources of credit, schools, and healthcare. Mobilized communities, assisted by the local anti-slavery organizations, are better positioned to secure needed services from governments and non-governmental providers. In India, for example, the government is supposed to provide a stipend to everyone who has been rescued from slavery. Now, in practice, this is often honored in the breach. But where there are these community committees that are advocating on behalf of slavery survivors, the likelihood of receiving that stipend goes up dramatically, and they can restart their lives. We also support the effort to increase the cost to the perpetrators of slavery. Now, sometimes the cause of poor law enforcement is inadequate training. It may be surprising, but in many cases, officials don't know, or police don't know their own laws. So in a typical year, we'll train about 1,500 government officials in anti-slavery work. Sometimes the issue is judicial administration. In Nepal, for example, one district judge reformed the court calendar to place trafficking cases among a group of severe crimes that receive expedited processing on the court calendar, where there had previously been a very long backlog. Sometimes we use media training as a useful adjunct to raise the costs and risks of perpetrating slavery. In the next panel, you're going to hear from a fabulous group called Reporter Brazil. It's a group of reporters who focus their work on populations, on companies that perpetrate slavery, and this turns up the heat and makes it more likely that there's going to be punishment. Now, of course, rescue of people in slavery is central to doing abolition work. And in a given year, we'll typically rescue 1,700 to 1,800 people who are in slavery. Now, they need medical care, psychological counseling, vocational training, and peer support to restart their lives. In Nepal, we work with an incredible group called Shakti Sabua, which was started by survivors of sexual slavery. It's all women who have formed groups that work to help each other in a series of self-help support groups so they can get access to the services that they need. Now, science requires measurement. Our key interventions, rights and risks education, community mobilization, strengthening access to services, increasing the risk of committing the crime of slavery, and survivor services, these are all measurable. We've defined specific indicators to measure the magnitude and quality of our interventions. The impacts we seek are also measurable, including resistance to slavery, the liberation of slaves, and a decline in the prevalence of slavery. Now, our experience has led us to believe that the interventions I have described result in a reduction in slavery. But we believe all anti-slavery organizations should be held to a very rigorous standard of demonstrating impact. We will continue to assess the validity and replicability of the abolition model. We'll adapt our approach as new findings emerge. We'll publish the results so that other organizations can benefit from our experience. And of course, we're more than happy to share whatever tools and methods we've developed. But more broadly, we believe that the abolition movement must adopt an intellectually rigorous approach. Science depends on evidence. We must candidly acknowledge the shortcomings of the data and evidence that are currently available. While there are global estimates of the magnitude of slavery, there has not been enough primary data collection about the magnitude and dynamics of slavery. Governments, out of embarrassment, have largely avoided genuine efforts to study the magnitude of slavery. There are very few rigorous studies of the efficacy of anti-slavery interventions. There's an urgent need to build a working consensus on the model for preventing and ending slavery. So we urgently recommend that governments and private donors support the research needed to better understand slavery and how to fight it. Now, I want to be clear. The need for research and better data is not an excuse for inaction. A great deal of practical knowledge has been gained by organizations like those who are participating in today's events, but we're going to have to learn while we're doing it. The coalescing of science, art, and politics holds promise of great progress against slavery. Now, I have seen slavery in all its ugly brutality. Young girls trapped in domestic servitude, little girls who are sold as sex slaves, little boys who are trapped on fishing boats, women who have been systematically beaten, men who are slaves in stone quarries. But I am certain that history is on the side of abolition, and sooner rather than later. Slavery has existed since agricultural surpluses first allowed a master class to emerge. For most of history, slavery was legitimate, it was legal, it was integral to the functioning of societies and economies. That era has ended. The force of law now stands against slavery. No country depends upon slavery for its survival. No economy requires slavery to flourish, as was once true in our own country. Religious leaders no longer invoke God and Scripture to permit slavery, but rather condemn it. The good news is that the percentage of the human race that is enslaved is at its lowest point in history, and a modern abolitionist movement is gathering force. Now, on the wall of my office is a photo of a group of Indian women. Now, these are women who had been imprisoned and enslaved in a stone quarry. And after going through the kind of process I've described here, being reached by education, going through community mobilization, determining their own destiny, they basically revolted against their master and took over the stone quarry and chased out the former owner and his thugs. And they now own the stone quarry. And underneath the photo is a quote we captured from one of the women. And it says, "We worked here for years without pay. This stone quarry is now ours. We will never be slaves again." Now, we draw heart and inspiration from those communities who are, with just a little bit of help, empowering themselves and grasping their own freedom. And as that happens, it becomes contagious, and the movement of slavery spreads from village to village. Now, it was, in fact, an abolitionist, Theodore Parker, who in 1857 first wrote that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. If we work together, if we bring together science and art and politics in the service of abolition, I am very confident that the long march from slavery to freedom will finally end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Before Maurice leaves, do we have any questions from people who... We have a mic here, and we have a mic here. So feel free to come up, and Maurice, I'll open you back to the camera.
You can also tweet. You can also tweet questions. I'll be standing on.
Hi. I participate with a group that supports efforts in a place called Tierra Bomba in Colombia. It's probably a place where you have, I've heard, it's, I don't want to say second most important city for human trafficking, but it's very common that the children are involved in sexual slavery, some as early as the age of 3. And many of their parents work in massage parlors and other industry. And my question is, because you mentioned these committees where the parents will try to protect their children, when sexual slavery is so deeply embedded in a culture like that, how do you start the ball rolling with having committees when parents just accept this is their fate and it's their way of life? Thank you.
Sure. So, well, thank you very much for that question. And it does point to sort of the depths of the problem. I think it would be very interesting for you to converse, in fact, with our friends from Haiti. Because the issue that I described there, it's called restabec, which is a Creole word meaning stays with, is in fact very deeply embedded in the culture and norms. And so in some ways there's a parallel to the situation that you described. Now I don't want to pretend to answer a situation with which I'm not personally familiar. But it does strike me that there is this parallel, that by asking people to tell their own story, because as people have gone through their lives, these are not lives that are not without pain. Right? People who have, the parents have themselves suffered as they grew up in this context. I doubt that they're happy that this is the life that their children are leading. And this process of participatory research helps people bring out the stories of their own lives. And our collective job is to distill those stories and bring them back to the community and say, these are the stories that you told us about your own lives. Is this what you want? What are the choices that you have? What are the options that are before you? Is there another way? And our experience is that when those conversations are led by trained facilitators and that they rely on the stories from their own lives, it is amazingly powerful. And people do get it. And that is the start of a process where the norms change, where new protective behaviors emerge. So it's difficult. It is time-consuming. This does not happen overnight. But I am actually quite convinced that such approaches are powerful.
Hi, quick question about, well actually, two-part question. First off, I noticed a lot of the things that you were talking about had to do with the slaves themselves, but my question has to do with what's happening in terms of the people who are causing slavery. Now, you can make policies and stuff like that, but that'll help prevent more criminals from going into it because in fear of being prosecuted by those policies. But at the same time, people who are already in the criminal organization aren't going to have much fear for those things because they're not planning on getting caught anyway. So is there any kind of tactical unit or anything like that happening in terms of stop those people? Because remember, the last time that our country combated slavery was in the Civil War. Well, it was about states' rights, but slavery as well. So, and then in addition to that, what can we physically do in those countries as to fly over and actually do something in those countries, whether it be with that or just to help those communities that you're talking about?
Okay, so two things. One is, please remember that one of the 5 actions that I said we need to take is to increase the cost and risk to those who perpetrate slavery. And so what we need to do is, in fact, to act to strengthen law enforcement and the judiciary Now, this may be by encouraging additional investment in law enforcement. It may be by better training of law enforcement. It may be by providing better technology. But the mobilization of the communities is also an important part of that, because they are then in a better position to demand police protection. Because when they're atomized and weak and uneducated, then they're not in a position to say, hey, you know this is happening. If we're experiencing it here, and your police station is just down the road, you know it's happening. So they are in a better position to demand police protection. It's also where the role of the media is very important, because, as you'll hear from Report of Brazil, good media attention, one of the things we do is provide media training in a number of countries, so that journalists are prepared to report on the topic of slavery. So I think there are a whole range of actions that can be taken to increase law enforcement and ultimately the penalties and risks for those who perpetrate the crime, along with strengthening the resistance of the vulnerable communities. Now, the thing I want to say to the second part of your question is, this is not something you give somebody else, right? Freedom isn't something you give to somebody else. This is something that is born and grows within a community. Now, there's a role for people who help facilitate the process, who provide some of the additional resources that may be needed. But this is really about people grasping their own destiny through the process of dialogue, of education, of organization, of acquiring access to better services. People free themselves. Other people don't come in and say, here's the gift of freedom. That's not how it works. Right? And that's what we're trying to do, is sort of facilitate that process where people can grasp their own freedom.
With the utmost respect and absolutely no political correctness whatsoever, I think your science and art and politics is missing a crucial piece, and the piece that Katerina talked about, and the piece that was actually on your video, which is the faith community. You have the World Vision sign on one of those places, and the people on the ground in those communities are making a huge difference. The other aspect of that is, I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but where believers are trapped into slavery by other faiths, which is happening a lot in Southeast Asia, especially with young Christian women, where they are put into domestic slavery. Is there some... are you guys working together?
Yeah, so, no, thank you. That's a very good comment and question. So, of course, faith-based organizations play a hugely important role in the anti-slavery movement. I like to say you can't do this business without faith. Now, we as an organization are not aligned with any particular faith. But they are critical. We do work collaboratively with faith-based organizations, both here in the U.S. and abroad, and they're an important part of the anti-slavery movement. So I agree with you, Tony.
Good afternoon. My question would be, is if these people are being enslaved due to a lack of a bare necessity in life, it's wonderful to come together. It's wonderful to stand up and bring all these programs and all this technology. But at the same time, the root of the matter is, what would you do for a Klondike bar? If these people are being taken advantage of because they're impoverished and cannot afford the bare necessities to survive, it's clean water, food, and things of that nature. If we don't provide that and all this other technology, then we leave them susceptible to become victims. Is how I see it in a manner. And as far as sex slaves, we as a free country should take responsibility on our lack of censorship that exploits the freedom and the luxuries of sex slaving, which make them feel more intrigued to come here and do this in our country.
Okay. Well, thank you for your question and your comment. I would just say that poverty is a contributing factor, but it's not the root cause. You can have a very modest income, but still be able to protect yourself. That has certainly been our experience. Now, I would add to that there is a component of our program that does try to help people gain alternative and better livelihoods. So when I talked about, for example, access to legitimate sources of credit, right? That is to what end? I mean, typically what people do with that is invest in small businesses or other economically productive activities. Sometimes what we do is help them gain access to expertise that helps improve livelihoods. So in Haiti, we helped a local organization, our local partner, hire an agronomist to help improve the productivity of the local farms. So improving livelihoods is part of the overall strategy. But I also, the danger in that line of reasoning, however, is that we don't want to say that we can't end slavery until we eradicate poverty, because that's not true. Modest incomes doesn't mean that you you necessarily become a slave, far from it.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for hosting this presentation, because prior to this I had little knowledge about what was going on, so I wanted to say thank you for that. My question is, you were talking about like how important it is to comfort people who are sex trafficking victims. I guess what I want to ask is, what warning signs can I look out for to kind of assist them?
Okay, so two things. Right? First, I want to broaden the definition a little bit, because, in fact, we heard some of that this morning in the first panel, that globally, the majority, 2/3 of people who are in slavery are in forced labor other than sexual slavery. There's some overlap between the two categories and not any division. But you want to think broadly. It's not just about sex trafficking. And there's strong reason to suspect that our counting of forced labor other than sexual slavery here in the United States, desperately undercounting that. And again, what I would say in terms of the signs of that, you heard some of that this morning. It is why, when you look for it, why is this person never moving from their domicile or place of work? Why do they appear to be in a state of timidity? Do they have their own source of income? You begin to see the signs and symptoms of it. It's almost like a disease that you can pick up on if you begin to look for it.
Thank you.
It doesn't come before you.
Hello. Well, my name is Juliet, and due to the importance of your work, I'm curious to hear only if you can. Give us an example of how, if you have encountered difficulties with the private sector or governments in some of the countries you work, for example, Southeast Asia or Central Africa. Because some of us are conscientious and have an everyday struggle with the products we buy, trying to figure out, like, okay, where is this coming from and who am I abusing indirectly? And I wonder if you have encountered difficulties with the private sector or the government, and how have you been able to address it?
Thank you. Yes, you're going to hear a panel this afternoon specifically around multinational businesses. And there are very positive examples of companies that are being quite responsible around this. I want to first say that. But the real key here is transparency around the supply chain. The question is, are companies being very transparent about their policies and practices and providing evidence of their inspection of the supply chain to be sure that the inputs into their businesses are not tainted by slavery. And it means going beyond the first level of acquisition of supplies. That is often, sometimes what companies say is, well, our suppliers, we check on our suppliers. Right? We inspect the premises, we make them sign, it's part of our contractual arrangement and so forth. Right? But the real question then is second, third, fourth, fifth level, because it is at that level that slavery is most likely to occur. So there really needs to be sort of a rigorous following of the supply chain to be sure that the products are not tainted by slavery at the far end. That's why we support there's a bill that we're pending for Congress based on a very good example in California, of a business supply chain transparency act. So that's where we think that the attention really needs to be. The other thing, of course, is that there are various organizations and websites that do look at the supply chains, fair trade, slavery footprint, and so forth. They just go online and look at the origin of the goods you're purchasing. I would also ask everybody to think about themselves as an investor. It's not only what we consume, it's what we invest in. And as investors, we also have the power to demand that the companies in which we invest are taking appropriate action to be sure that slavery isn't present in their supply chains.
We'll just take one more question.
Today is very eye-opening for me. It's a subject matter I know not a lot about. However, I've been a student of history, and going back to Spartacus and the Romans, every major change in the area of slavery and trafficking has required strong combative activity. I don't see at the UN, I don't see even here, even with these acts we talked about today, and I applaud the task forces and activities. I don't see a war on trafficking. I don't see the level of physical contact that's going to be necessary, especially outside the United States, let alone inside the United States. What's happening in that regard? We drop seals to stop marijuana. Why aren't we dropping seals to stop slavery?
Thank you. I would thank you for your comment. I think I would just say that if you look back over the last 20 years ago, there was virtually no consciousness, no awareness that modern day slavery existed, right? I mean, the conversation, in fact, people said, no, it's gone. This is a problem in the past. We ended that. It's over. It doesn't exist anymore. So I would argue that, in fact, in the last 20 years, there's actually been already quite a remarkable transformation in terms of the awareness and the beginnings of a modern abolitionist movement. Where I would very much agree with you is we are nowhere near, not even remotely close to the magnitude of effort that is required to eradicate the problem. Let me give you a concrete example. First, it's very hard to figure out how much the U.S. government spends on this because the money is in different pots and departments and so on. But as far as we can tell, it's about $85 million a year. Let me say that again. $85 million a year to combat slavery worldwide. Now, you took out seals dropping in. That is, compared to some of the other ways money gets spent, it is a pittance. Right? And in order to eradicate slavery, there's going to have to be a level of committed investment, certainly not just by the United States, that we do have a unique leadership role to play, but certainly the whole movement must be at a magnitude, at a level, at an intensity that we're not even close to yet. But I am very optimistic, and that's why we spend the time and attention on gatherings like this, that we're building a movement, and what we need is for people like you to be engaged in the movement, and that's ultimately what's going to make the difference.